Transmedia storytelling. This is what we're going to cover in this lecture. We're going to look a little bit at text world theory, then we're going to move on to look at story world, because text world and story world are not the same things. Then we'll move on to this notion of transmedial storytelling, and then the difference between a franchise or transmedial, and also then why tell a transmedia story. So before we get into that, one thing to bear in mind is that transmedial storytelling is a new development that has arisen partly out of postmodernism and that idea that we can draw information and different elements of stories and styles and visuals and audio and anything we fancy from previous pieces. So we saw this, I think, when we looked at no, actually, that wouldn't be in this lecture series, but you might have seen this in things like postmodern architecture that is a mishmash of different styles. You see it in some postmodern novels as well. And this whole idea of postmodernism is essentially being able to draw upon previous styles and stick them all together. So very much the mash-up is a huge element of postmodernism, and that has been taken on by this notion of transmedial storytelling. Anyway, let's look at, first of all, text world theory. Okay, so there is a link at the top there. So if you download these lecture slides from Moodle, you can actually follow that link. But even if you can't download the slides, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can still go to that link and find out a bit more about this notion of text world theory. And essentially, it's a linguistic model, but it's to try and understand how we actually make sense of texts in our brains, so a cognitive model. And it essentially means that as soon as we open a book, let's say a novel, we realise that we are in different types of worlds. So we perhaps might first come across in a novel, or in any book indeed, we might come across all of the paratext. So that's all of the stuff at the beginning that tells you who it was published by, when it was published, and all of those details. Now we realise that that is a particular type of text that appears at the beginning of most books, and we know that that follows particular rules and is organised in certain ways. So we could call it a sort of world, so it's a text world that we understand. And then we might move on to the novel itself. And as it says there, the basic premise for text world theory is that human beings process and understand all discourse by constructing mental representations of it in their minds. So that means not sort of a virtual representation of the story, because that belongs to story world, and we'll come on to that in a moment, but actually that we understand in non-fiction, for example, that this particular text that we're reading exists within this frame of this book, and that it follows particular rules, and that they are perhaps similar in other similar books. So story world is where we understand that there is an entire world that a story has been set in, and that's could be a very similar world to our own. But if we are reading a novel set in the present day, for example, we realise that the characters who are in the story are generally not real people, but we still, in our imagination, endow them with all the same freedoms and dreams and physical traits and attributes and so on that we would for somebody in the real world. So, we imagine them as a real person. So as it says here, so one's memory, so this is from Tom Wolfe. So Tom Wolfe is an extremely famous American novelist who wrote The Right Stuff and Bonfire of the Vanities, and is regarded as, you know, one of the great 20th century American writers. So this is what he said. So one's memory is apparently made up of millions of sets of images which work together on the identikit principle. The most gifted writers are those who manipulate the memory sets of the reader in such a rich fashion that they create within the minds of the reader an entire world that resonates within the reader's own real emotions. The events taking place on the page, in print, but the emotions are real. Hence the unique feeling when one is absorbed in a certain book or lost in it. So this is where we can be reading about, as I say, the real world, but equally we might be reading a novel that's set in a fantasy world, and we can imagine that entire world beyond the boundaries of necessarily what's described on the page. So the story world can actually be much, much bigger than just what we read on the page. So as it says, this is quoted by Mary-Laure Ryan in Narrative as Virtual Reality 2, which is an extremely useful book if you are interested in this idea of how story works and how story worlds work, and particularly if you're interested in how story worlds work within, yes, novels, but also where other places that we find narratives. So film, television, video games, and you know, various different sort of digital storytelling methods. So Mary-Laure Ryan sort of talks about all of this and is very much a digital literary scholar. So what is this a world? You know, how does Mary-Laure Ryan actually describe what a world is? And she has 4 features that she suggests that a world actually has. So this connected set of objects and individuals, a habitable environment, a reasonably intelligible totality for external observers, and a field of activity for its members. So what does that mean? Well, essentially it means that we should, when we're reading a novel or playing a video game or watching a film or listening to an audiobook, we should actually have, for a world to work, particularly if it's a complete fantasy world, it needs to have things in it. Things that relate to one another. So that's the objects and the individuals. So, you know, that's your characters. So things that relate to one another. There should be stuff in the world. The environment should be possible for the individuals, the characters, to be able to live in it. And if they can't live in it, well, maybe that's the story, but, you know, clearly they are alive. So how are they doing that? So, you know, that then becomes part of the stories or the world's lore, and, you know, how the plot perhaps unfolds. So, you know, even if we're watching a film like The Martian, you know, we know that that environment isn't habitable, but the character played by Matt Damon is actually trying to make it habitable. And, you know, that of course is the story. So he is living there. It's extremely harsh and difficult to live in, but he can live there. So this is where, you know, we have stories about, perhaps, as I say, sort of harsh, uninhabitable environments, but our characters somehow manage to inhabit it. So it is habitable. You know, we can't have a story where it's impossible for people to go. And again, you know, if you think about any story where you might think to yourself, well, you know, in that particular story, they said it was impossible to go there, but the characters did it. Well, then clearly it is habitable. And as I say, part of the story is how they make it habitable. That's their sort of monster, if you like, to overcome. And then you also need this reasonably intelligible totality for external observers. In other words, it needs to make sense. this world has to make sense. It's no good if you decide, okay, or the author decides, I'm going to make a world that is entirely two-dimensional, and the characters that live in it are letters of the alphabet, and they just are randomly spread onto the page. Well, that sounds a very interesting possibility for maybe an art project, and something very much an unusual creation, but it needs to make sense in some way for your audience. Otherwise, the audience aren't going to stay with you if they're just seeing jumbled up letters on a page and there's nothing for them to actually begin to understand and to connect and to communicate with. Then it's not going to work. And then the last one, you need to have a field of activity for its members. So this is, and I'm really sorry if you can hear this cat meowing in the background. Anyway, field of activity for its members. This essentially is some place, a space for your characters, and for them to actually do things, scenes and so on, but also somewhere that the audience can go and read and visit and so on. But essentially it's about setting for the characters. So you've got your connected set of objects and individuals, the stuff, but they need to be in a place. That's our field of activity, the setting. So that then moves us on to this notion of STORYWORLD coming first and the medium second. Now, if you remember way back at the beginning of this term and when we started this module, we looked at in the very first week what a medium is and what media are, because of course medium is the single, media is the plural, and of course the media has multiple different meanings. But here what we're talking about is how the story world, the world that, for example, Harry Potter lives in, his world exists before the book or the films or the video games or the cafes or whatever medium is being used. But the world, the story world, is the bit that we all know, and it can be presented in lots of different ways. Okay, I'm going to pause it there, and I would like you to go and have a look at some definitions of story world and also some definitions of text world, and see if you can sort of understand and tease apart the differences between these. And as I say, remember that text world is about the discourse on the page, and there is not necessarily a story there at all. But it's absolutely the furniture that we see on the page, what we expect, maybe paratexts or intertextual details. It's the stuff that we recognise on the page, whereas story world is absolutely about this imagined place that belongs to a story and the world that this story inhabits. So we'll pause it there. Go and have a look at those two. There are some links on Moodle where you can find out more, and then we'll come back to talk some more about this notion of transmedial storytelling.